On a brisk evening in 1944, the lights of Carnegie Hall glowed against the New York night, and inside the grand hall a woman of silver hair and splendid attire lifted her chin, prepared to sing as though destiny itself had called her. The vast room, filled with thousands, held its breath before the first notes broke into the air. Welcome, dear listener, wherever you may find yourself across time and space. Tell us in the comments when and where your ears join this gathering of memory. And if you wish this circle of stories to continue, do not forget to press the subscribe button, adding your voice to the quiet chain that binds us together. It was on that October evening, within the hallowed walls of Carnegie Hall, that Florence Foster Jenkins stepped forth. Dressed in robes of white, a crown of laurel perched upon her head like a mark of imagined triumph. Outside, the world was deep in the turmoil of war, and yet within the hall a different kind of battle was about to unfold, one fought not with weapons but with notes and silences, with expectation and astonishment. For this was no ordinary recital, and she was no ordinary performer. Many in attendance had come not out of reverence for her art, but out of curiosity, even hunger for spectacle. Tickets had vanished within hours of being released, and so an audience of more than 3,000 gathered, waiting to hear the voice that was already whispered about in salons and parlors as both wondrous and dreadful. The chandeliers above trembled slightly, casting a golden light across the velvet seats. One could almost sense the mixture of perfumes, of fur coats brushed against one another, of programs rustling in restless fingers. When she entered, applause rose like a tide, not entirely out of admiration, but from that strange energy that swells when people know they are witnesses to something unusual. She bowed with dignity, her gestures grand and deliberate, the air of one certain of her rightful place on that stage. Her accompanist sat ready at the piano, fingers poised to guide her through arias once sung by the greats. Then came the first note. It wavered, thin and piercing, sliding into the air not with the precision of a trained soprano, but like a bird caught between windows. The song itself was one known for its clarity and beauty, yet under her voice it became distorted, reshaped into a pattern no composer had ever envisioned. Gasps escaped into the dimness, muffled laughter stirred like wind through dry leaves. Yet she pressed forward with fearless conviction, her face alight with joy, her arms rising in sweeping gestures as though she conducted not just the orchestra, but the very heavens. What is it that makes a voice beautiful? Is it perfect pitch, control of breath, mastery of tone? Or is beauty something stranger, found in courage, in the refusal to be silent even when silence would protect us from shame? In that hall, Florence's notes rang wrong to the ear, but there was also something undeniable in the force with which she gave herself to them. Each area, whether Mozart or Verdi, emerged transformed, often unrecognizable, yet carried by an energy that dared the listener to dismiss her entirely. The audience shifted between ridicule and awe. Some laughed behind gloved hands, their shoulders shaking in shadows. Others sat in wonder, uncertain whether they should laugh or weep. There were even those who cheered sincerely, swept up by her confidence, her refusal to yield to any sign of weakness. For Florence believed utterly in her gift. She did not step onto that stage to amuse, but to offer what she believed to be her divine calling. Between songs, she left the stage to change her costume, each more elaborate than the last. She appeared as a Valkyrie, as a glittering angel with wings that brushed against the curtains, as a lady of ancient Greece crowned with golden laurels. The theater filled not only with sound, but with images, with symbols of her imagined glory. Applause echoed after each appearance, and though it was often mingled with laughter, it was still applause, still sound and recognition. Those who were there would later recall the peculiar sensation of that evening. Some said it was unbearable. Others said it was unforgettable. The newspapers would write about it with a mixture of cruelty and fascination. Yet at that moment within the hall, Florence herself was untouched by ridicule. Her smile shone bright as she sang, her eyes lifted toward the balconies, perhaps seeing only devotion, not mockery. To her, the concert was a triumph, proof that she belonged among the greats. And yet, as the final notes faded and the audience erupted into applause, some earnest, many sarcastic, one could sense an undercurrent of tragedy beneath the spectacle. For here was a woman whose wealth and will had carried her to the greatest stage, but whose talent could not match her dream. It was as if destiny itself had played a cruel jest, granting her the means to be heard by all, yet denying her the gift of harmony. The sound of applause still lingers in memory, applause that was thunderous yet fractured, both celebration and mockery, applause that lifted her spirit even as it concealed the laughter hidden within. That sound is where her story begins, with the echo of hands meeting in shadow and light, and the question that remains even now. Did she know? Did she sense the difference between admiration and ridicule, or did her faith shield her ears? The applause fades slowly, like rain retreating into silence. Only the image remains of Florence Foster Jenkins bowing at Carnegie Hall, radiant with joy, certain of her triumph, while beyond the stage, whispers curled like smoke in the gilded rafters. The echo of applause lingering in the rafters of Carnegie Hall long after the audience had gone is not only the sound of an evening, but the reverberation of an entire life. It drifts backwards across the years, traveling from the grand New York stage to a small town in Pennsylvania, where another sound was first heard, gentler, simpler, the hesitant notes of a child at the piano. There, in the quiet town of Wilkes-Barre, Florence Foster was born in 1868, a time when America still bore the scars of war and uncertainty. The Foster household was respectable and prosperous, her father a lawyer and banker whose influence afforded comfort, while her mother watched over the domestic order. The world was smaller then, the streets lined with clapboard houses and gaslight lamps, yet within young Florence there stirred the vast desire of something larger, a calling that no provincial place could contain. From her earliest years, it was music that spoke most clearly to her. She was drawn to the piano, her small hands stretching across the ivory keys, testing sounds as though she were in conversation with an unseen companion. The family noticed her enthusiasm, and soon lessons were arranged, and as the seasons passed, her progress quickened. The parlor became her stage, and the upright piano her first companion in ambition. In those hours, she was not the daughter of Charles and Mary Foster, but an artist in embryo, shaping sound, imagining audiences beyond the walls of her home. The neighbors would sometimes pause outside to listen, and though they heard only scales and exercises, she felt in their presence a recognition of something greater. Children often dream without restraint, their ambitions untouched by the caution of adulthood. Florence dreamed in such a way, imagining that she might one day travel to the great cities of Europe, that her name would stand beside Mozart and Chopin, that her fingers would command the piano with such mastery that no hall could contain the applause. Was it only the imagination of a child, or was there in her an early glimmer of that strange certainty that would guide her entire life? The belief that she was chosen for greatness. The line between the two is delicate, for what we call delusion in age may be nothing more than dreaming in youth. The Foster home was a place of gentility, its evenings lit by oil lamps, its rooms filled with the scent of polished wood and the faint tang of coal smoke. Florence would sit at the piano long after supper, her mother sewing nearby, her father reading quietly, the rhythms of domestic life surrounding her in a cocoon of safety. Yet within her heart grew an urgency, a desire not merely to play but to be heard, to be acknowledged. Even then, she seemed to seek an audience, as though the act of music was incomplete without the gaze of others. When she was still young, her parents arranged for her to perform in small local gatherings, and the applause she received, polite, encouraging, modest, seemed to ignite a fire within her. She was not content with the limits of Wilkes-Barre. She wished for conservatories, concert halls, the great stages of Europe. Such ambition was rare for a girl of her age and station, yet it burned with a steady flame. In those years, Florence believed her destiny lay not in the drawing rooms of Pennsylvania, but in the salons of Vienna, the concert halls of Paris, the gilded theaters of Milan. It was not the voice, but the piano that first carried her forward. She studied with devotion, practicing until her fingers ached, determined to carve a path as a concert pianist. Teachers spoke of her promise, her sensitivity, her diligence. She believed herself on the threshold of greatness. And yet, even in those hopeful years, fate began to whisper otherwise. For illness came, sudden and merciless, striking when her hands were still young and supple. Scarlet fever, that cruel companion of the 19th century, visited her and left its lasting mark. She survived, but her strength diminished, her dexterity never fully recovered. The piano keys, once her friends, now resisted her touch. Notes faltered, passages blurred, the precision that distinguished mastery slipped from her grasp. For a child who had placed all her dreams in the piano, it was a quiet devastation, not shouted or seen, but carried in the tremble of her hands, the slowing of her progress. What does one do when the path one has chosen is blocked? Does one turn aside? Does one despair? Or does one seek another road to the same imagined destination? Florence was still a child, yet already she seemed to possess that resilience, that peculiar refusal to surrender which would mark her life. If she could not command the piano, perhaps she would command the voice. If her fingers betrayed her, perhaps her breath and her song would not. Thus the dream shifted, altered, but remained intact. She would be a great musician still, not through ivory keys, but through the music of her throat and lungs. One wonders how much she truly knew, how much she sensed of the weakness in her playing, how much she acknowledged the loss. Was she conscious of her limits, or did she believe the world simply failed to see her talent? The truth is shrouded, for she left little record of doubt. What remains instead are traces of determination, the recollections of those around her who noted her confidence, her assurance that she was destined for artistry. The scarlet fever in stealing her piano may have planted within her the seed of that curious self-belief, the conviction that no obstacle could deny her purpose. As the years passed and she grew into young womanhood, the piano receded into the background, though it never entirely vanished. She continued to play, but it was no longer her chosen weapon. Her eyes turned toward the voice, that mysterious instrument carried within the body itself, hidden yet powerful. To sing was not only to perform, but to reveal the soul, and in this she felt her true calling emerging. It was as though the illness had not closed the door, but redirected her steps toward another entrance. In Wilkes-Barre, she remained an unusual figure, her ambitions far exceeding the modest expectations of her town. The seasons changed, coal dust settled over streets, trains whistled in the distance carrying wealth from mines to markets, yet Florence dreamed of opera houses glittering with chandeliers. The applause she once imagined at her piano now echoed in her ears as the applause of unseen audiences for her voice. In the quiet hours, perhaps she could even hear it, that phantom sound which one day would accompany her at Carnegie Hall. Applause both real and imagined, both sincere and mocking. And so, from the lingering echo of a small parlor piano, through the whisper of illness that reshaped her path, Florence's story began its long ascent. The applause of Carnegie Hall was still decades away, but already it existed as a ghost in her childhood dreams, a sound she chased even as the world began to prepare its cruel joke. The image of that young girl at the piano remains, her hands hovering, uncertain, a shadow of frailty across her fingers. The keys lie silent for a moment, waiting, while outside the Pennsylvania night presses against the windows. What note will she strike next, and what path will it open? The silent piano waiting in the parlor seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that its role in Florence's destiny had already shifted, that the touch of her hands no longer carried the certainty it once did. Illness had passed through her body like a thief in the night, leaving scars unseen but deeply felt. Scarlet fever had weakened her, stripping away the strength and agility that her fingers once promised. Though she continued to play, the confidence of her youth had been shaken, and in the quiet spaces between notes there lingered hesitation, a tremor that betrayed both body and spirit. It was during these fragile years that Florence began to understand the peculiar duality of her existence. On the one hand, the fire of ambition that burned brightly within her, and on the other, the frailty of her physical body, which often betrayed her grandest desires. She was never entirely free from the shadow of illness. As a child, she had survived, but survival in the 19th century did not mean recovery as we know it now. It meant carrying forward with hidden weaknesses, with invisible burdens, with energies that might fail when most needed. The fever left her delicate, and delicacy, though admired in Victorian girls as a trait of refinement, was for her a chain that tethered her away from her chosen destiny. Her family did what they could to protect her. The Fosters, secure in their social position, ensured she lacked nothing in comfort, but comfort was no replacement for vitality. There were days when Florence would sit by the window, gazing at the world outside, the sound of children playing in the distance, and she felt the ache of stillness, the sense that her body constrained her spirit. She'd been given dreams too vast for her strength. The fever seemed not only to limit her, but to whisper constantly of fragility, reminding her that her path would not be the same as those robust enough to conquer the rigors of training and performance. Yet the resilience of Florence's imagination was remarkable. She refused to yield to despair. If her hands faltered on the piano, her voice might yet rise where her fingers failed. She began to sing more often, to experiment with the notes her throat could form, imitating the songs she heard in parlors, in traveling performances, in the music that reached her from beyond Wilkes Barre. Singing was different from playing, for it required no perfect dexterity, only breath and faith. In her own perception, she found a new path toward greatness, one perhaps even grander than the old, for singers were adored not only for their music, but for their presence, their glamour, their embodiment of art itself. What strange irony it is that illness in closing one door often tempts us toward another that is even less certain. The piano, though demanding, is at least honest. One can measure skill in the clarity of scales, in the mastery of passages. The voice, however, is elusive. It is bound not only by training, but by the unique gift of one's body. Florence, hearing her own voice, must have believed it capable of greatness, for she pursued it with determination. Yet to others, even in those early years, it must have sounded unusual, perhaps uncertain, not aligning with the standards of beauty that the age revered. Did she not hear the difference? Or did she hear it and transform it in her imagination into something finer than the truth? The scarlet fever, some suggest, did more than weaken her hands. There are whispers that it may have damaged her hearing as well. If so, then her voice would never have sounded to her as it did to others. Perhaps she truly believed herself in tune, the notes rising as they were meant to, even as listeners tilted their heads in perplexity. Such a possibility adds a shade of mystery to her entire life, for what is ridicule if the person ridiculed does not perceive the flaw? If Florence heard beauty where others heard discord, then her story becomes not one of deception, but of tragic misalignment between inner world and outer world. As she grew older, entering adolescence, the memory of illness never left her. She carried its fragility into her daily life, aware always of the limitations placed upon her by fate. Yet she also carried ambition like a shield, using it to push back against weakness. Those who knew her spoke of a young woman of unusual confidence, one who spoke often of her destiny in music, who dreamed of studying abroad, of performing on the stages of Europe. Such confidence might seem out of place in one whose health was fragile, but perhaps it was precisely the fragility that fueled her. Knowing life could slip easily away, she clung fiercely to her vision of immortality through art. The piano in the parlor still stood, a silent companion, sometimes played, sometimes ignored, its presence a reminder of what might have been. Florence's hands could no longer command it with brilliance, but she did not turn away from music entirely. Instead, she sang beside it, her mother sometimes accompanying her gently on the keys, creating small moments of harmony within the home. To those who listened, her voice was striking, though not always for the reasons she believed. It carried passion, intensity, a kind of fearless abandon. But passion is not the same as skill, and even in her youth there were murmurs that her singing was unusual, even strange. Still, in the protected environment of family and friends, she received encouragement, indulgence, and admiration, enough to sustain her conviction. And so the years of illness, rather than extinguishing her dream, reshaped it into something more peculiar, more dangerous, more vulnerable. The body that betrayed her also gave rise to the legend she would become. For it is in weakness that delusion often takes root, and in delusion that stories find their tragic power. Had Florence remained a pianist, capable but unremarkable, her name would have vanished into obscurity. But the fever, in taking that from her, set her upon a path where her name would be remembered forever, not for what she achieved, but for what she believed she had achieved. The night outside Wilkes-Barre pressed against the windows. The lamps flickered. The piano keys waited in silence. Florence's body was frail, her future uncertain. Yet within her the fire of ambition burned undiminished. She rose from illness not with resignation, but with renewed determination, convinced that she would yet find her stage, her destiny, her applause. The silence of the piano lingered, but in her imagination she heard something else. The sound of her own voice soaring beyond the walls, beyond the small town, into halls yet unseen. The fever had changed her, had wounded her, but it had not silenced her. Instead, it had given her a new instrument, one that seemed limitless in her mind, even if in reality it bore the same cracks and flaws as her fragile body. In that silence, where the piano waited and the voice began, her path turned irrevocably toward the stage, toward the songs that would one day both enthrall and amuse thousands. The parlor, once filled with the disciplined sound of scales, now filled with the unmeasured sound of singing. Notes rose and fell, sometimes wandering, sometimes triumphant, always earnest. Outside, the Pennsylvania night deepened, the coal smoke drifting through the air, and still she sang, her voice mingling with the shadows, declaring to herself that nothing, not illness, not fragility, not even fate itself, would keep her from glory. The sound of her singing fades into the night, unresolved, uncertain, echoing faintly as though carried by wind. It leads us forward to the next turning, to the story of a marriage that would shape her life in ways both tender and tragic. The fading sound of her singing at night seemed to drift beyond the small windows of Wilkes Barre, dissolving into the dark hills, carrying with it a yearning for life beyond the narrow streets of her town. It was this yearning that drew Florence, still young and hopeful, into the arms of a man whose name she would carry for the rest of her life, a man who appeared at first as companion and admirer, but who left her with scars more enduring than the fever of her childhood. His name was Dr. Frank Thornton Jenkins, and in him she saw the promise of a broader horizon. He was older, educated, worldly in ways that must have appealed to a girl whose ambitions were already pressing against the limits of her provincial home. Their union seemed at first to open a door into adulthood, into a wider life where Florence might pursue her dreams with the support of a husband of standing. Marriage in those days was often less a romance than an arrangement of futures. For Florence, however, it seemed to combine both hope and necessity. She was of an age when society expected her to secure her place, and here was a man who could provide not only companionship but stability. To those who watched, it was a respectable match. To Florence, perhaps, it was also a stepping stone, a way to leave behind the shadows of illness and small-town life, to begin carving out the life of grandeur she had long imagined. Yet beneath the polished surface of marriage there often lie cracks unseen, and in Florence's marriage those cracks would open swiftly and with devastating consequence. For Dr. Jenkins carried with him not only the role of husband, but also the burden of betrayal. Somewhere in the early years of their union, some say even before the vows had cooled upon their lips, he infected her with syphilis, a disease that in the late 19th century was both incurable and unspeakable. It was not merely an illness of the body, but a social stigma, a mark of shame that women, especially, bore in silence. Florence never spoke of it openly, but the evidence lies in the course of her life. The frailty that deepened, the physical ailments that shadowed her, the inability ever to bear children, the lingering pain that seemed to accompany her for decades. To imagine her in those years is to imagine a young woman filled with dreams, suddenly confronted by the slow poison of betrayal. Her body once again made the battleground for forces beyond her control. The fever had stolen her piano, and now her marriage stole her health, her motherhood, her innocence. What thoughts must have passed through her mind when she realized what had happened? Did she rage against him? Did she accuse him? Or did she swallow the bitterness in silence, as so many women of her time were forced to do? The truth remains hidden, but what is certain is that her marriage to Dr. Jenkins did not last. They parted, though she continued to bear his name, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of convenience, perhaps even out of irony. Florence Foster Jenkins she became, and Florence Foster Jenkins she would remain, though the man himself receded into the shadows of her story. This hidden wound of betrayal, like the scarlet fever before it, shaped her path in ways both seen and unseen. It robbed her of the chance to have children, leaving her life without heirs, without the ordinary domestic anchor that might have quieted her ambitions. Deprived of motherhood, she turned more fiercely toward art, seeking in music the legacy and immortality denied her in family. Her health, already delicate, was further weakened. The disease lingered in her blood, flaring in symptoms, burdening her body. And yet she lived on, not quietly, not in retreat, but in pursuit of an ever grander dream. Here lies one of the strangest truths of her story. That tragedy did not silence her, but propelled her. Betrayal did not turn her inward, but outward. Instead of collapsing beneath the weight of illness and disappointment, she seemed to inflate with confidence, building around herself a world where she was untouchable, admired, destined for greatness. Perhaps it was a defense, a way to survive pain too great to confront directly. Perhaps it was delusion, rooted in the altered perceptions of her illness, or perhaps it was simply the resilience of a spirit that refused to acknowledge defeat. The echoes of this marriage never left her. They accompanied her like a shadow, unspoken but ever present. In later years, when she sang of love, of betrayal, of triumph, Did she not carry within her the personal knowledge of those themes, even if her voice distorted them beyond recognition? In her eyes, perhaps, she was not merely performing arias, she was embodying her own story. A woman wronged, a woman triumphant, a woman undiminished. And so, from the quiet parlor of her youth to the broken vows of her marriage, Florence's path bent once more. She emerged from the collapse of her first union not broken, but strangely strengthened, as though each wound gave her fresh conviction that she was destined for something beyond the ordinary. Divorce or separation in those times often carried stigma, yet Florence seemed untouched by such considerations. She stepped forward into life still believing in her artistry, still believing in the greatness awaiting her. The night outside Wilkes Bar once again pressed in, the coal trains groaning in the distance, the lamps burning low. Inside, Florence carried her new burden, one heavier than fever, heavier than silence. Yet she sang still, her voice rising into the darkness, carrying not only her dreams but her wounds. The sound was not beautiful, not in the conventional sense, but it was insistent, unyielding. She would not be silenced, not by illness, not by betrayal, not by the cruelty of fate. And so the hidden wound remained, carried with her into New York, into the salons of wealth and ambition, where she would begin to weave the strange legend of her later years. The betrayal of Dr. Jenkins, the disease he left her with, did not define her outwardly, but inwardly it shaped every choice, every performance, every desperate grasp at immortality. It was the unseen thread running through her life, the secret note beneath every aria she sang. The image of her lingers here, a young woman separated from her husband, her body bearing scars invisible to the world, her future uncertain, her eyes still fixed on glory. She stands in the doorway of her next chapter, stepping away from the shadows of Wilkes Bar toward the bright lights of New York. The faint sound of her singing carries into the night, unresolved, reaching forward into the salons where gowns rustle, where candles flicker, where applause awaits, not the applause of family, but of strangers whose laughter and admiration would one day blur into the same sound. The soft rustle of gowns in candlelit parlors replaced the silence of Wilkes Bar, and with it came a new chapter in Florence's life, one that carried her into the heart of New York's social world. She arrived not as a defeated woman, but as a figure determined to reinvent herself, to clothe her wounds in silk and laughter, to exchange the coal dust of her childhood home for the glitter of chandeliers and polished floors. New York, with its avenues alive with carriages and later motor cars, with its theaters, its salons, its endless movement of wealth and ambition, welcomed her as it welcomed all who could pay the price of admission. And Florence could pay, for her family's prosperity provided her with the means to step across the threshold into the world she had always imagined belonged to her. The city in those years was a place of contrasts. The roar of industry in its factories, the elegance of its Fifth Avenue mansions, the clamor of immigrants arriving daily at Ellis Island, and the refined hush of drawing rooms where society gathered to listen, to gossip, to admire. Into these rooms Florence ventured, her presence notable not for beauty nor for brilliance, but for a certain confidence, an assurance that made her difficult to ignore. She had carried her name with her, Florence Foster Jenkins, and though the marriage that gave her that name had ended in bitterness, the sound of it lent a note of distinction, suggesting ties to education and respectability. In the parlors of New York, she found both a stage and an audience. There were musicals, those semi-private concerts hosted by wealthy patrons, where singers, pianists, and violinists performed before an audience of peers. Florence began to appear at these gatherings, at first as a guest, then as a performer, presenting herself as both hostess and artist, weaving together her social standing and her artistic ambitions. Here, in smaller circles, indulgence reigned. To criticize openly would have been impolite. Instead, polite applause covered hesitation, and Florence, hearing only the applause, believed it proof of her artistry. The rustle of gowns, the clink of crystal glasses, the faint perfume of lilies and roses. These became the atmosphere in which she thrived. She filled her evenings with music and conversation, surrounding herself with those who encouraged her, whether from genuine affection or quiet amusement. For wealth has always had the power to bend the truth, and in her presence, few dared speak the harsher words that critics might later publish. Within the sheltered world of salons, she could be a prima donna, adored and applauded, the imperfections of her voice softened by the indulgent glow of candlelight and the smiles of acquaintances. And yet, even here, shadows lingered. Florence's health was never strong, her body still burdened by the secret legacy of her marriage. There were days when she tired easily, when pain shadowed her, when she retreated into rest. But she refused to let frailty define her. Instead, she used wealth as a kind of armor, clothing herself in finery, surrounding herself with luxury, building an image that concealed the vulnerability beneath. In her gowns, her jewels, her elaborate coiffures, she presented herself as a diva, as a figure meant for admiration. The gap between reality and image widened, yet she stepped confidently across it, as though unaware it existed at all. What is it about wealth that allows dreams to persist beyond reason? For most, failure would silence ambition. A singer without skill would be corrected, rejected, turned away. But Florence had the means to continue, to arrange performances, to publish programs, to create the illusion of success. And when the illusion is repeated often enough, does it not begin to feel like truth, at least to the one who lives within it? The applause of New York's salons, though polite, reinforced her conviction. She began to believe more deeply in her destiny as a singer, even as laughter stirred quietly behind fans and in corners. The city itself seemed to mirror her contradictions. Outside, New York was raw, full of hunger and striving, where immigrants worked in sweatshops for pennies, where skyscrapers rose into the clouds, while tenements crumbled in poverty. Inside the salons, however, there was only refinement, only the glow of wealth, only the illusion of a world where beauty and art were the highest pursuits. Florence belonged wholly to this latter world. She cultivated an identity, not as a wounded woman, but as a benefactress of music, a patroness, and above all, a performer in her own right. She began to organize her own gatherings, concerts held in intimate spaces where she could select her audience. These performances became known among her circle, attended by those curious to see her, those eager to bask in the spectacle, and those who genuinely adored her eccentricities. It was within these rooms that the legend of Florence Foster Jenkins began to take shape. Here she could sing without fear of hostile criticism, for those invited were carefully chosen, and those who laughed did so softly, hidden behind smiles. Within this controlled sphere, Florence thrived, oblivious to or dismissive of the judgment that might wait beyond. In these candlelit nights, where her voice rose unevenly above the piano, Florence felt herself a star. The rustle of gowns, the polite applause, the admiring eyes, all confirmed her belief. She could not see, or would not see, that much of it was indulgence rather than admiration. Perhaps she suspected, perhaps she did not. Perhaps in the strange theater of her life, the line between truth and illusion blurred so thoroughly that even she could not distinguish them. Yet there is a certain poignancy in these evenings, for within them lies not only delusion, but also courage. To sing before others, even without skill, requires a kind of bravery. To continue To insist upon one's dream in the face of whispers and hidden laughter requires a spirit that refuses humiliation. Florence carried that spirit with her, and it lent her performances a strange magnetism. People could laugh, but they also could not look away. And so the soft rustle of gowns, the flicker of candles, the applause of salons carried her forward. The betrayal of her first marriage, the shadow of illness, the silence of the piano, all these lay behind her. Ahead stretched the golden halls of New York, where she would build a life not as a wife or a mother, but as a performer and a patroness, a woman whose wealth and will made her a presence impossible to ignore. The parlors grew warm with laughter and applause, yet outside the city stretched in restless noise. The rattle of carriages, the clang of streetcars, the shouts of newsboys calling the day's headlines. Beyond the candlelit salons lay a world larger, harsher, where critics wrote with sharpened pens, where applause could not be controlled. Florence, for the moment, remained within her circle, safe in its indulgence. But fate, ever cruel, was already preparing the next turn, where inheritance and independence would change the scale of her ambitions forever. The opening of doors gilded with fortune followed the dim glow of salons, and when Florence's mother passed away in 1930, the inheritance she received transformed her life more completely than any performance ever had. The sum was vast, enough to free her entirely from financial concern, enough to allow her to do not only what she pleased, but to do so with flourish. Until then, she had lived with comfort, supported by family wealth, but now she became mistress of her own fortune, unanswerable to the cautions of parents or husbands. Independence arrived not gently, but like a sudden illumination, and Florence, already convinced of her destiny, embraced it as confirmation that the path she had chosen was ordained. Money is a curious thing. It can silence doubt, it can create a stage where none exists, it can bend the perceptions of others. For Florence, it became the invisible orchestra accompanying her every appearance. With it, she could hire pianists, rent halls, publish programs, commission costumes of extraordinary imagination. With it, she could gather audiences of her choosing, filling her rooms with those who would never dare speak openly against her. With it, she could insulate herself from ridicule, at least for a time, creating around herself a world where applause was inevitable. And so the inheritance did not lead her toward quiet security, as it might have for another, but toward extravagance. She began to live more openly as the diva she believed herself to be. She adorned herself with jewels, arranged concerts with increasing regularity, and poured her energy into the cultivation of a persona larger than life. She was not merely Florence, she was Madame Jenkins, patroness of the arts, leading lady of her own stage. The world outside might have whispered doubts, but within the sphere she controlled, she was adored. Her independence brought with it also a new boldness in relationships. No longer bound to family or husband, she surrounded herself with companions who supported her visions. Among them, none was more important than St. Clair Bayfield, the English actor who became her manager, companion, and in many ways her protector. Their relationship was not bound by marriage, but by a peculiar mixture of affection, loyalty, and mutual benefit. He flattered her, guided her affairs, and shielded her from the sharpest edges of criticism. She, in turn, provided him with stability, comfort, and perhaps a strange kind of devotion. To see them together was to witness a partnership less ordinary than enduring, less passionate than protective. With Bayfield at her side and wealth at her command, Florence expanded her performances. The salons that had once been her stage grew too small. She began to rent larger venues, modest halls where tickets could be distributed, often without charge, to audiences eager for the spectacle. And spectacle it was, for her performances were no longer simple recitals, but productions. She appeared in elaborate costumes, often of her own design, transforming herself into angels, queens, and mythic heroines. The inheritance allowed her not only to dream, but to embody those dreams in fabric and gold thread. Her appearances became events, spoken of in whispers across New York, half in amusement, half in fascination. Wealth also shielded her from truth. Those who worked with her, accompanists, costume makers, venue managers, were unlikely to risk offending her, for she paid generously. Applause, too, could be purchased, or at least insured, for when tickets were distributed freely and audiences gathered in expectation of amusement, clapping was guaranteed. Florence heard the clapping, not the laughter that often accompanied it, and in that sound she found confirmation of her genius. Inheritance had given her independence, but it had also deepened her delusion. For without opposition, without the risk of failure, her illusions grew unchecked. One might ask, did she know? Did she truly believe herself a great singer? Or did she secretly recognize the truth and choose instead to lean into spectacle, to make herself a figure of amusement rather than artistry? The answer is elusive. Those closest to her claimed she believed in her gift utterly, that she was blind to her faults, that she heard only beauty in her own voice. Others suggest she must have known, at least dimly, and that her eccentric performances were a way of turning ridicule into applause, of transforming mockery into fame. Whichever is true, the result was the same. Her inheritance allowed her to live entirely within her chosen illusion, to shape her life not according to reality, but according to her vision of it. The Great Depression that struck America in those years touched millions with poverty, hunger, and despair. Yet Florence seemed untouched. While others queued for bread, she commissioned gowns of silk and sequins. While the world suffered, she sang arias in drawing rooms and rented halls, oblivious to the contrast. Perhaps it was selfishness, perhaps simply blindness. But in her own world there was no room for sorrow. Music, however flawed, was her escape, her triumph, her immortality. Her wealth created a bubble in which she lived, and within that bubble the hardships of the wider world did not intrude. It is easy to judge, but perhaps one should also reflect. How many of us would choose differently if fortune suddenly placed every dream within reach? Would we not also seek to turn our longings into reality, even if others laughed? Florence, with her inheritance, did only what her heart demanded. The tragedy lies not in her pursuit, but in the world's response, in the mixture of indulgence and mockery that greeted her. As the years passed, her reputation grew. She became known throughout New York society, not as a great artist, but as a curiosity, a spectacle. Invitations to her concerts were coveted, not for the music, but for the experience. To attend a Jenkins recital was to witness something unforgettable, to laugh discreetly, to marvel at her costumes, to be swept up in her fearless confidence. And still she remained unaware, or chose to remain unaware, convinced that her inheritance had allowed her to fulfill her destiny. Thus the opening of gilded doors led her deeper into her own legend. Wealth, independence, companionship, these she now possessed. What she lacked in talent, she replaced with determination, with grandeur, with sheer will. The applause she heard was no longer confined to salons. It now filled larger rooms, echoing more loudly, blurring ever further the line between admiration and ridicule. The image lingers of her stepping through those doors of fortune, jewels glittering, costumes gleaming, her eyes alight with conviction. Behind her lay betrayal and illness, behind her the quiet of Pennsylvania, but before her stretched the stages of New York, each larger than the last, each carrying her closer to the heights and the precipice of her strange destiny. The doors close softly behind her, but ahead another figure waits, steady and loyal, ready to guide her further. The sound of her wealth rustling in silk is soon joined by the steady presence of St. Clair Bayfield, the companion who would stand beside her for decades, shaping her legend as surely as she shaped her voice. The steady hand of St. Clair Bayfield emerged beside her as she stepped more deeply into her world of imagined triumphs. He was an English actor, tall and dignified, whose charm carried with it the refinement of the stage, though his own career never rose to brilliance. For Florence, however, Bayfield was not merely a companion but a kind of guardian, a presence that steadied her, encouraged her, and at times shielded her from the sharper edges of reality. Their meeting in the years following her inheritance marked the beginning of one of the strangest and most enduring partnerships in the annals of performance, a bond less defined by passion than by loyalty, less by romance than by mutual necessity. In Bayfield, Florence found the support she craved. He admired her extravagance, flattered her ambitions, and accompanied her on the journey she was determined to follow. She, in turn, offered him stability, wealth, and a place at the center of a peculiar orbit that grew more luminous as her legend took shape. He became her manager, arranging her performances, shaping her programs, organizing the practical details that transformed her visions into reality. He was also her companion, living with her in comfort, though never as husband, for the specter of her first marriage, and perhaps the illness it left her, meant she never remarried. Their relationship was one of intimacy without official bonds, a partnership that puzzled many but endured for decades. It is easy to imagine them together in those years. Florence radiant in costume, her eyes alive with conviction, Bayfield beside her, attentive, encouraging, sometimes amused, sometimes protective. He must have known the truth of her voice, must have heard its discord, yet he never wavered in his devotion. Whether out of love, self-interest, or a mixture of both, he helped preserve the illusion she cherished. His presence at her side allowed her to believe she was not alone in her greatness, that others saw what she saw. In this way, he became as essential to her performances as the gowns she wore or the notes she attempted. Bayfield's role was not only practical, but emotional. When laughter rippled through audiences, he was there to reassure her. When critics wrote cruel words, he softened their impact or ensured she never read them. He built around her a cocoon, a protective space where she could continue in her belief, undisturbed by the harsher judgments of the world. Some might call this cruelty, enabling her delusion. But perhaps it was also kindness. For what good would truth have done her? Would it have stopped her from singing, or only crushed the joy she found in performance? In protecting her, Bayfield ensured she lived in the light of her own dream, rather than in the shadow of ridicule. Yet their partnership was not without complexity. Bayfield, though loyal, also lived a double life. He maintained a relationship with another woman, a quiet, domestic arrangement that Florence tolerated, or perhaps chose to ignore. Theirs was not a conventional bond, but one of necessity and endurance. She needed his companionship and guidance. He needed her patronage and affection. Together they created a life that, though unusual, was steady, each fulfilling a role the other required. In this way, their lives intertwined, not as husband and wife, but as something stranger and perhaps more enduring. It is tempting to see Bayfield as a mirror, reflecting back to Florence the image she longed to see. Where others laughed behind closed doors, he applauded openly. Where others doubted, he encouraged. He was the constant presence that gave her confidence, the figure who reminded her that she was not a solitary dreamer, but a celebrated diva. In his devotion lay both her strength and her vulnerability, for without him her world might have collapsed, but with him it grew ever more distant from reality. Together they navigated the world of New York society, appearing at gatherings, hosting soirees, arranging concerts. Bayfield ensured that her performances were polished in presentation, if not in sound. He organized the programs, selected accompanists, managed invitations. Florence, in turn, filled the stage with her costumes and her unshakable confidence. Their partnership was a duet of sorts. She provided the vision, he provided the structure, and together they created the spectacle. What did Bayfield truly think as he sat in the wings, listening to her voice soar and falter, watching audiences laugh discreetly into their sleeves? Did he smile in secret, or did he truly believe in the sincerity of her art? Perhaps he occupied the same blurred space as Florence herself, where truth and illusion mingled. Perhaps he, too, chose to see her as she saw herself, a great diva, rather than confront the discordant reality. In this lies the strangeness of their bond. It was sustained not by truth, but by shared belief, by a mutual decision to inhabit a world of their own making. The years they spent together built the foundation for her later fame, for without Bayfield, Florence might have remained a curious figure in small salons. With him, she expanded, reaching larger audiences, growing bolder in her ambitions. He guided her gently but firmly, ensuring her path led always forward, never back, even as the world began to whisper more loudly about her peculiar talent. His devotion allowed her to dream without restraint, to believe herself unstoppable, even when reality suggested otherwise. Their companionship also softened the loneliness that illness and betrayal had left behind. Florence had no children, no husband, no family close at hand. Bayfield became her anchor, the figure who filled the emptiness with constancy. They dined together, traveled together, worked together. In his presence, she found reassurance. In his loyalty, she found comfort. If love is measured not by passion but by endurance, then theirs was a love of peculiar strength, lasting through decades of laughter, ridicule, and triumph alike. The image of them lingers. Florence adorned in feathers and sequins, her arms raised as though conducting the stars, and Bayfield just behind the curtain, his eyes fixed upon her, his applause the most faithful of all. Their duet was not in music but in life itself, a partnership that carried her forward toward the grandest stage of all. And so the steady hand of St. Clair Bayfield guided her from the salons into larger halls, from indulgent gatherings into performances of increasing notoriety. He was her protector, her manager, her companion, her mirror. Together they shaped the legend that would one day echo through Carnegie Hall. The sound of his hand upon her shoulder lingers, steady, reassuring. From that touch, the stage opens once more, and Florence, with Bayfield by her side, steps into the earliest recitals where applause was polite, indulgent, and faintly mocking, yet always enough to sustain her dream. The perfumed air and polite laughter behind fans became the atmosphere in which Florence first truly allowed her voice to be heard beyond her inner circle. With Bayfield at her side to organize the evenings, she began to host recitals in drawing rooms and private salons. Those intimate stages where reputation could be built and where indulgence often mattered more than truth. These gatherings were small worlds unto themselves, carefully curated, where friends, acquaintances, and a sprinkling of strangers filled chairs arranged beneath chandeliers, their programs printed, their expectations veiled in curiosity. The air was heavy with perfume and anticipation, though it was a different anticipation from that which accompanied the appearance of true virtuosos. Here, the audience came less to be transported by music than to be entertained by the spectacle of Florence herself. She would enter dressed in gowns of satin and velvet, sequins catching the candlelight, jewels glittering at her neck and wrists. Her face glowed with confidence, her eyes shining with the certainty that she was about to deliver art of the highest order. For her, these evenings were sacred, confirmations of her divine calling. She bowed with grace, lifted her chin, and began to sing. The piano guided her, often played by an accompanist whose skill far outstripped her own. The voice that followed was her own strange instrument, rising and falling without control, drifting sharp or flat, notes landing where they should not, yet delivered with the conviction of a seasoned diva. The audience responded with politeness, for to laugh openly in such company would have been unseemly. Instead, they masked their amusement behind fans, behind discreet coughs, behind the rustle of programs. Smiles were exchanged in corners, shoulders shook in suppressed mirth, but outwardly the applause was genuine enough. Florence, hearing only the applause, believed herself adored, her artistry recognized, her destiny unfolding, and in that belief lay both her tragedy and her triumph. For though her ears may not have caught the whispers, her heart was filled with certainty. These recitals became a regular part of her life. Invitations were sought after, not because the music was sublime, but because the experience was unforgettable. To attend a Jenkins recital was to enter a world where truth and illusion mingled, where one could marvel at her costumes, her dramatic gestures, her sheer confidence. People came not to hear beauty, but to witness the audacity of a woman who dared to present herself as a diva in spite of every discordant note. And yet, even as they laughed quietly, many also felt a strange admiration. For was it not courageous to stand before others and give oneself so completely, regardless of skill? In these rooms, Florence's legend began to crystallize. She became known among New York society not only as a patroness of the arts, but as a performer in her own right. The salons, filled with the scent of roses and the warmth of candlelight, became the incubators of her myth. Guests would leave whispering of her eccentricities, of the curious quality of her singing, of the costumes that transformed her into Valkyries and angels. Word spread, and curiosity grew. Soon her recitals were attended not only by friends, but by those eager to see the spectacle for themselves. Bayfield managed it all with quiet efficiency. He distributed tickets, arranged programs, ensured that audiences were composed of those who would not disrupt the illusion. His loyalty insulated her, protecting her from the cruelty of open laughter. Behind fans, behind whispers, people might mock, but in her presence, applause was given, and applause was all she required. To Florence, each recital was a triumph, proof that her voice was worthy of the stage, that her destiny was unfolding as it was meant to. And so the rooms of New York echoed with her singing. The chandeliers trembled with her high notes. The polished floors reflected the glimmer of her costumes. The guests applauded with a mixture of indulgence and fascination. For a time, she was content with these smaller stages, these gatherings where she was both hostess and diva, where her artistry was celebrated, or at least not denied. It was within these spaces that she cultivated her identity, rehearsing for the larger stages that would one day await her. Yet even in these intimate recitals, the shadow of irony lingered. For every note that soared off-key, for every phrase delivered with unsteady breath, there was an unspoken acknowledgement in the room that Florence was unlike any other performer. She was not great in the conventional sense, but she was unforgettable. And in art, perhaps, being unforgettable is its own kind of greatness. The laughter behind fans, though discreet, carried with it a strange affection. People did not despise her. They were charmed by her eccentricity, by her determination, by her refusal to be anything less than the star she believed herself to be. The salons became places not of ridicule, but of gentle amusement, where Florence's performances were remembered fondly, even as they were mocked. She was, in a sense, loved for her faults, admired for her audacity, and applauded for her courage. In these rooms, perfumed and glowing, she was safe. The wider world of critics and public opinion lay beyond, but here she could sing without fear. The applause sustained her, the laughter was muffled, the illusion intact. It was a fragile balance, but one that lasted for years, long enough to establish her as a figure of fascination in New York society. The image lingers. Florence, radiant in feathers and sequins, standing before a piano, her arms raised as though summoning the music of the heavens, while behind fans and folded programs, her audience suppressed their laughter and applauded all the same. The air is heavy with perfume. The sound of her voice trembles in the chandeliers, and in her heart she believes she has conquered another stage. But beyond these private rooms, larger halls awaited. The applause of friends and acquaintances would soon be joined by the applause of strangers, and with it the laughter that could no longer be hidden. The perfumed air fades, replaced by the rustle of costumes and the feathers that would brush against candlelight in performances more elaborate, more public, more unforgettable still. Feathers brushing against candlelight marked the next transformation of her performances. For Florence soon discovered that her voice alone, fragile and uncertain as it was, could not wholly carry the grandeur she envisioned. To bridge the gap between her inner vision and outer reality, she turned increasingly to costume, to spectacle, to the drama of appearance. It was not enough to stand before a piano in evening dress. She must become larger, more mythical, more transcendent. And so she began to design and commission costumes of astonishing imagination, garments that shimmered with sequins, rustled with silks, and sprouted wings that grazed the edges of curtains. Her costumes were not chosen with subtlety, but with conviction. She appeared as an angel, with wings of white feathers spreading behind her like a vision descending from heaven. She appeared as a Valkyrie, armored in gleaming breastplates and crowned with golden laurels, her voice straining to rise above the piano as though to summon the armies of gods. She appeared as queens, as heroines of legend, as beings half divine. Each costume was a declaration, a visual embodiment of the greatness she believed her singing conveyed. The chandeliers reflected the glitter of her gowns. The air shimmered with candlelight caught in sequins, and audiences gasped, sometimes in wonder, sometimes in disbelief. The effect was undeniable. Even when her voice faltered, her costumes commanded attention. She filled the stage not with music, but with image, with spectacle, with a grandeur that silenced, at least for a moment, the temptation to laugh. For to see her in such attire was to encounter a vision, one that demanded recognition. The audience might snicker at a note gone astray, but they could not deny the boldness of a woman who dared to transform herself into living myth. Florence herself took immense pride in these creations. She worked closely with designers, sometimes even sketching her own visions, ensuring that every feather, every jewel, every thread of silk contributed to the illusion she sought to create. To her, these costumes were not frivolous decorations, but essential to her artistry. They were extensions of her music, visual notes that amplified the sound she believed herself to be producing. In her eyes, she was not merely singing arias, she was embodying them, becoming the characters, the angels, the warriors whose songs had been written centuries before. Audiences, of course, interpreted differently. Many attended her recitals not for the music, but for the costumes, for the chance to witness what outrageous creation she would unveil next. The performances became as much theatrical events as musical ones, remembered less for the sound than for the spectacle. People whispered about the angel wings that knocked against music stands, about the crowns that tilted precariously, about the capes that trailed like rivers of gold across the stage. They laughed, yes, but they also admired the sheer audacity. Who else would dare such extravagance? Who else would step so boldly into the role of diva without possessing the voice that justified it? There is a kind of poetry in these costumes, for they reveal more about Florence than her voice ever could. They speak of longing, of the desire to be seen not merely as a woman of society, but as a figure of destiny. They speak of the gap between her inner world, filled with visions of triumph, and the outer world, filled with whispers of ridicule. And they speak of her courage, her refusal to diminish herself, her insistence on grandeur, even when laughter pressed against the walls of the hall. In feathers and sequins, she declared to the world that she was not to be ignored. What did it feel like, one wonders, to step onto a stage dressed as an angel, to feel the weight of wings upon her shoulders, to hear the intake of breath from the audience, to sing with the certainty that heaven itself listened? Did she not, in those moments, transcend ridicule, living wholly within the dream she had built for herself? The truth of her voice mattered little to her then. What mattered was the image, the conviction, the applause that followed, however mixed its motives. Bayfield, ever faithful, supported these flights of imagination. He ensured that costumes were prepared, that stages were arranged to accommodate their extravagance, that Florence could step forth with confidence. He applauded her daring, praised her vision, encouraged her to push further. Together they built not mere recitals but spectacles, performances that would be remembered long after the notes themselves had faded. And indeed, remembered they were. Even today, the descriptions of her costumes linger as brightly as the accounts of her singing. It is as though the garments themselves carried her into legend, symbols of her eccentricity, her audacity, her tragic grandeur. They were the feathers that brushed against candlelight, catching fire in memory, if not in reality. Her audiences grew, for curiosity fed on curiosity. To see Florence Foster Jenkins perform was to join a select circle of those who had witnessed something extraordinary, even if extraordinary did not mean sublime. It meant unforgettable. People left her recitals talking less of the music than of the vision she had presented, less of her notes than of her wings. And perhaps that was her triumph, that she managed to be remembered, not for her failures, but for her insistence on greatness, however strangely expressed. The salons that had once contained her performances now seemed too small for such splendor. Her costumes demanded larger stages, larger audiences, larger echoes of applause. The feathers brushed against candlelight, but soon they would brush against gas lamps and electric light, against the expectations of the wider public, where indulgence was harder to guarantee. The stage was widening, and with it the risks grew. Yet Florence, radiant in her conviction, pressed forward, certain that each new costume, each new performance, was a step closer to immortality. The image lingers. Florence as a Valkyrie, her arms raised, her breastplate gleaming, her voice straining toward the heavens, while the audience, caught between amusement and admiration, cannot look away. Feathers tremble in the heat of candles, sequins scatter light like stars, and in her eyes burns the certainty of triumph. Beyond this vision, however, waits another form of permanence, one that will preserve her not in feathers and silk, but in sound, the crackle of recordings that will outlive her and carry her voice into eternity. The crackle of phonograph needles rose like a faint ghost in the air, carrying with it the fragile permanence of sound captured upon discs of shellac. For Florence, the costumes, the feathers, the jewels were dazzling but fleeting. They vanished with the dimming of lamps, dissolved with the dispersing of audiences. To be truly immortal, her voice itself had to be preserved, carried forward beyond her own lifetime. And so she turned to recording, convinced that what she produced in song deserved to live forever, etched into grooves that would spin and replay her genius for generations yet unborn. The process of recording in those years was neither simple nor forgiving. There were no subtle manipulations, no devices to correct pitch or mask error. The singer stood before the horn of the machine, the pianist close by, and every note that left the throat was pressed directly into the disc. It was a merciless medium, stripping away illusion, preserving not only the intention but the flaws, the breaths, the missteps. Yet Florence approached it with the same confidence that carried her onto stages. She believed utterly that what she sang would be treasured, admired, revered. The crackle of the needle was, to her, the sound of destiny taking shape. She recorded arias, art songs, pieces that had challenged even the great sopranos of her time. Her voice on those discs was no different from the voice that audiences had heard in salons, straining, breaking, wandering, sharp or flat, yet delivered with fierce conviction. The recordings reveal a woman, fearless in her approach, unshaken by discord, entirely immersed in the grandeur of her own performance. There is, in the sound, something at once comic and tragic, for the ear that listens cannot help but recognize the failure of technique, yet also cannot deny the intensity of spirit. Florence listened to the records herself and was pleased. Where others heard discord, she heard triumph. She sent copies to friends, distributed them with pride, shared them as gifts of artistry. To her, the recordings were proof of her greatness, evidence that she belonged among the immortals. She may even have believed that the occasional distortions, the odd leaps of pitch, were the fault of the machine rather than her own voice, for in her ears the sound she produced was as flawless as she imagined it. The irony is profound, that these recordings, made to preserve her genius, instead preserved her infamy. They became the evidence by which the world outside her circle would judge her, the permanent reminder of her peculiar gift. Where a recital might be forgotten in time, a recording endures. And so the voice of Florence Foster Jenkins, distorted yet confident, lives still, echoing across decades, drawing laughter, fascination, and sometimes even affection from listeners who never knew her. What did it mean to her, one wonders, to hold a disc in her hands, its grooves carrying the imprint of her voice, to know that she had captured herself in sound? Did she imagine posterity treasuring it, studying it, admiring her as they admired Caruso or Melba? The thought must have thrilled her, for she pursued recording with enthusiasm, producing more than a dozen sides that together form a strange legacy. Her voice was now eternal, immune to death, carried by machines into living rooms and parlors far beyond her reach. Audiences who attended her recitals began to hear the records as well, and word spread further. The recordings circulated not only among admirers, but among those curious to hear for themselves the voice that inspired such whispers. They became curiosities, treasures of oddity, collected and replayed in amusement. In this way, her fame spread beyond New York, beyond the salons and halls where she performed. She became known in circles far removed from her own, her reputation crossing borders, her legend growing with every spin of the needle. Bayfield encouraged her in this pursuit, as always. He ensured the sessions were arranged, the discs pressed, the copies distributed. He praised her for her foresight, for her courage, for her artistry. Whether he truly believed in the value of the recordings or merely wished to please her, the effect was the same. Florence felt vindicated, convinced that her voice would outlast her. The crackle of the needle was, for her, the sound of eternity, the whisper of immortality sealed in shellac. The recordings also transformed her relationship with audiences. Those who attended her recitals often came already familiar with her voice, eager to witness in person the figure whose sound they had heard in private. The discs became invitations, advertisements, spreading her fame in ways even she may not have imagined. Each note pressed into shellac widened the circle of those who knew her, those who laughed, those who marveled, those who whispered of her audacity. She was no longer merely a local curiosity. She was a phenomenon. And yet, within this phenomenon lies something tender, something almost tragic. For Florence did not seek to amuse. She did not intend to become a figure of ridicule. She sought only to share her gift, to preserve her genius, to give the world what she believed it longed for. Her recordings, in her mind, were sacred offerings, treasures for the ages. That others receive them with laughter was not part of her vision. She lived in the glow of her own certainty, untouched by mockery, and in that glow she found joy. It is perhaps this joy that lingers most strongly when one listens even now. For beneath the discord, beneath the technical flaws, there is a spirit unbroken, a courage undiminished. Florence sings not timidly but boldly, as though she truly commands the stage of the world. And perhaps that is why she endures, why her recordings are still played, why her name has not vanished into the shadows of forgotten society figures. She dared to sing, dared to record, dared to believe in herself utterly. And in that daring, she achieved a kind of immortality more peculiar, more ironic, and perhaps more enduring than the immortality she sought. The crackle of phonograph needles fades, the discs stacked upon shelves, their grooves carrying her voice into the future. The image of Florence listening with delight lingers, her eyes bright, her hands resting upon the smooth black surface as though it were a sacred relic. Beyond the walls of her home, however, the whispers grow louder, for while recordings spread her fame, they also spread the mockery she had been shielded from. Outside the safety of her circle, the world was beginning to laugh more openly, and whispers of ridicule seeped back, faint but insistent, into the closed drawing-room door. Whispers outside the closed drawing-room door carried laughter and disbelief. Yet within the room itself, Florence remained shielded by a circle of devotion, a company of admirers whose loyalty transformed her performances into acts of reverence rather than ridicule. These companions, drawn from the peculiar intersections of art, society, and eccentricity, surrounded her not merely as an audience, but as protectors. They applauded when others laughed. They encouraged when others scoffed. They built a wall of adoration around her that muffled the harsher sounds of the world. Without them, her illusion might have shattered. With them, it was preserved, nurtured, and strengthened. Among these admirers were friends from New York society, men and women of means who enjoyed the novelty of her salons, who delighted in her costumes and eccentricities, and who, in their indulgence, gave her the sense of triumph she craved. Some were patrons of the arts themselves, accustomed to supporting artists whether brilliant or mediocre, and in Florence they found a kind of living curiosity, a character who embodied both tragedy and comedy in equal measure. To praise her cost little, to applaud her required little effort, and in return they gained a place within her peculiar circle, a place that itself became a mark of distinction. Others were artists and musicians of less fortunate station, grateful for her generosity, for Florence was known to support those who flattered her or worked within her sphere. She hired accompanists, commissioned costumes, paid musicians to perform alongside her, and in doing so she ensured their loyalty. Few would risk alienating a benefactress so generous, even if it meant suppressing their own doubts about her talent. In their applause lay gratitude as well as affection, a practical devotion as much as an emotional one. And then there were those who genuinely adored her, not for her skill, but for her spirit. They admired her courage, her audacity, her refusal to be silenced by frailty or ridicule. They loved her eccentricity, her delight in performance, her willingness to be entirely herself in a world that often demanded conformity. For these admirers, Florence was more than a curiosity. She was an inspiration, a reminder that one could live according to one's dreams, regardless of what others thought. They cheered her with sincerity, and in their voices she heard only devotion. Bayfield, ever her steadfast guardian, ensured that these admirers remained close, that their applause was always present, that their protection surrounded her like a fortress. He managed invitations, carefully selecting audiences that would not betray her with open laughter. He encouraged her friends to praise her, to reinforce her belief in her own genius. In this way, the circle of loyalty deepened, becoming almost a cult of devotion, where Florence reigned as queen, unchallenged, adored, secure. Within this circle, the outside world could not intrude. The newspapers might print their cruel words, strangers might whisper in ridicule, but Florence was shielded. In her drawing rooms, in her rented halls, she was always applauded, always celebrated. The closed door shut out the world, and within, the illusion thrived. The sound of her voice, however distorted, was met with admiration, and admiration was all she required. There is something deeply human in this arrangement. Who among us does not long for a circle of loyalty, for friends who protect us from ridicule, who applaud us even when we falter? Florence had such a circle, and within it she flourished. Perhaps they deceived her, perhaps they enabled her delusion, but perhaps they also gave her the greatest gift, the ability to live her life in joy, unburdened by the cruelty of truth. Yet the whispers outside the door never entirely ceased. They pressed faintly against the walls, growing louder as her fame spread, carried by recordings, by gossip, by the curiosity of those who had never seen her but longed to. The circle of loyalty could protect her only so far. Beyond it, the world was less kind, less indulgent, less forgiving. Florence remained largely unaware, or chose to remain unaware, but the tension between inner adoration and outer mockery was growing. Her admirers, too, must have felt this tension. Some laughed in secret, amused by the spectacle even as they applauded. Others struggled with the dissonance between their affection for her and the reality of her performances. Yet none betrayed her openly. They clapped, they cheered, they praised, they preserved her joy. In their loyalty lay both love and complicity, for they sustained the illusion that allowed her to continue. In these years, Florence lived as though wrapped in silk, her life softened by devotion, her art preserved by applause. The drawing rooms glowed with candlelight, the air thick with perfume, her costumes glittering in their sequins. She sang, she bowed, she basked in admiration, and the circle around her ensured that nothing harsher reached her ears. For Florence, this was triumph. For her admirers, it was a performance of another kind, one in which they played their part to perfection. The image lingers. Florence at the center of her circle, radiant, adored, her voice rising in song, her companions applauding with devotion, their faces smiling, their whispers silenced. Beyond the door, however, the whispers stir still, carried in newspapers and gossip, in laughter spreading through the city. Soon those whispers will grow louder, no longer contained, no longer hidden, until even Florence cannot avoid them. The door closes softly, the applause fades, and in its place comes the faint rustle of newspaper ink staining curious fingers. The world beyond her circle beginning to take notice, beginning to judge more openly the diva who could not sing. Newspaper ink staining curious fingers became the new conduit of her fame, for as Florence's recitals grew larger and her recordings spread further, the private whispers of salons spilled into the public press. New York, a city that thrived on gossip and spectacle, had taken notice of her. At first the notices were discreet, passing mentions in society columns, reports of musicals hosted by the eccentric Florence Foster Jenkins. They described her costumes, her gatherings, her charitable patronage. But as her reputation expanded, the tone sharpened, and soon the words of critics, printed for all to see, revealed the laughter that had long been stifled behind fans. The newspapers described her voice with a mixture of astonishment and amusement. Writers marveled at her confidence, at her willingness to tackle arias that challenged the greatest sopranos, even as they noted her inability to remain in tune. Some mocked her openly, their descriptions cruel in their precision, notes compared to shrieks, arias likened to sounds of animals or broken instruments. Others were more indulgent, framing her as a curiosity, a phenomenon of society, a figure whose performances were less about music than about spectacle. Yet whatever the tone, the effect was the same. Florence was no longer merely a private eccentric, but a public figure, discussed, debated, ridiculed, admired. The ink carried her name into households that had never attended her recitals. People who had never seen her now knew of her, laughed about her, speculated about her. Invitations to her performances became coveted not only among her loyal circle, but among those eager to witness the legend for themselves. The newspapers, by mocking her, had given her what she most desired: fame. And yet that fame was double-edged, for it was built less on admiration than on ridicule, less on talent than on incredulity. Florence herself seemed untouched by the shift. If she read the reviews, she interpreted them through the lens of her own certainty. If critics mocked her, she believed they misunderstood her artistry, or that their words were the envy of lesser spirits. Bayfield and her circle did their part to shield her, to dismiss the press as irrelevant, to reinforce her conviction that she was adored. And indeed, in her drawing rooms and rented halls, the applause remained as thunderous as ever. Yet beyond those walls, the laughter was growing louder, no longer confined to whispers, but echoing in print, spreading through the city like a rumor too delicious to contain. What strange alchemy transforms ridicule into fame? For many, such criticism would be devastating, silencing ambition, driving them into retreat. For Florence, however, it seemed only to increase her determination. The more the world laughed, the more she performed, as though she believed the laughter itself was proof of her importance. Better to be mocked and remembered than to be forgotten in silence. She embraced her notoriety, wore it like a crown, convinced that the very fact she was discussed confirmed her greatness. Her audiences grew more diverse. Alongside her loyal admirers now sat strangers drawn by curiosity, by the desire to see for themselves the diva the newspapers described. They came prepared to laugh, to marvel, to witness the spectacle, and laugh they did, though often discreetly, for the aura of her confidence. Her costumes, her sheer presence, demanded at least a semblance of respect. They applauded, sometimes sincerely, sometimes ironically, but always loudly, and Florence, hearing only the applause, believed herself triumphant. New York society, ever hungry for characters, embraced her as one of its eccentrics. She became a subject of dinner party conversation, a figure whose performances were recounted with laughter and fascination. To attend a Jenkins recital was to participate in a shared joke, a social ritual, a badge of belonging. Yet amid the laughter, there was also affection. People did not despise her. They cherished her for her audacity, for the joy she brought, however unintentional. She had become part of the fabric of the city, a character as much as an artist, a story as much as a singer. And yet the cruelty of the press should not be overlooked. For beneath the mockery lay a human being, a woman who had endured illness, betrayal, and loneliness, who had built her life upon the fragile foundation of a dream. The laughter that spread through newspapers may not have reached her ears directly, but it shadowed her nonetheless, pressing against the closed doors of her drawing rooms, waiting for the moment when even her loyal circle could no longer shield her. There is a melancholy in imagining Florence reading the papers, her hands smudged with ink, her eyes scanning the words that mocked her. Did she laugh with them, believing herself in on the joke? Did she dismiss them entirely, convinced of her superiority? Or did some part of her, however small, feel the sting, the ache of ridicule seeping through her armor of confidence? The truth remains hidden, as much a mystery as her voice itself. The newspapers, in mocking her, also preserved her. Their words ensured that her name would live on, that her performances would be remembered, that her legend would endure. Without them, she might have remained a private eccentric, known only to a small circle of friends. With them, she became immortal, her story carried forward not in music, but in print, not in applause, but in laughter. The image lingers, a figure in sequins, radiant beneath chandeliers, her voice rising fearlessly, while outside in the streets of New York, newsboys shouted headlines and readers smiled over coffee at the curious reports of a diva who could not sing. The ink smudges their fingers, the laughter ripples through parlors and offices, and Florence, radiant in her belief, sings on, untouched. But ink fades, and what remains is the woman before the mirror, smiling serenely at her reflection, certain of her greatness, even as the world beyond reflects her differently. The mirror glows with her smile, and from its glass begins the next chapter, where self-image, serene and unshaken, becomes the truest stage upon which she performs. A smile lingering in the mirror's reflection became her greatest companion, for when Florence Foster Jenkins looked upon herself, she did not see the figure others described in their cruel wit. She did not hear the laughter carried by newspapers or the whispers shared between acquaintances. What she saw was a woman chosen by destiny, adorned in beauty, graced with genius, and upheld by the hand of divine favor. In the privacy of her rooms before the glass, she rehearsed not only her arias but her conviction. Her reflection smiled back, serene and unshaken, echoing the certainty that she was, indeed, the great diva she had always believed herself to be. The mirror became her stage as much as any salon. Draped in costumes of feathers, sequins, and flowing silks, she practiced her gestures, her entrances, her dramatic flourishes. She bowed to unseen audiences, raised her arms as though conducting celestial choirs, and tilted her head in graceful acknowledgement of applause. To Florence, these rehearsals were not fantasies, but confirmations, as real as any recital. For the truth of her artistry lived not in the ears of others, but in the unwavering vision she carried within herself. This self-image was both shield and sword. It shielded her from ridicule, protecting her from the sting of mockery that pressed ever closer from the world outside. It also served as sword, granting her the courage to step boldly onto stages, to attempt arias beyond her reach, to present herself without hesitation. Where another might falter, Florence pressed forward, her reflection in the mirror reminding her always that she was extraordinary. Psychologists might name it delusion, a refusal to perceive reality. But within Florence's life, it became something more complex, a blend of faith, resilience, and necessity. Without it, she might have collapsed under the weight of illness, betrayal, and ridicule. With it, she thrived, carving out a strange immortality. Was it not, in its way, a form of genius to believe so thoroughly in oneself that the laughter of others could not intrude? To live in such certainty, unshaken, is rare, whether foolish or sublime. Her friends and admirers reinforced this self-image, reflecting back to her the vision she already carried. They praised her performances, applauded her gestures, flattered her eccentricities. They, too, became mirrors, confirming the reality she preferred. Bayfield, above all, ensured that nothing pierced her illusion. He praised her brilliance, shielded her from criticism, encouraged her to attempt ever grander feats. The world she inhabited was thus carefully constructed, a hall of mirrors reflecting only the image she desired, and Florence, gazing into each reflection, believed. The persistence of this belief gave her a serenity that astonished those who met her. She did not doubt, she did not falter, she did not question her path. Even when confronted indirectly with ridicule, she remained unshaken, interpreting laughter as envy, criticism as misunderstanding, and applause as proof. She lived in harmony with her own dream, and that harmony was more powerful to her than any discord others might perceive. One wonders what she truly heard when she sang. Did her ears transform the sound, softening its flaws, rendering it beautiful to her alone? Did her mind, convinced of her greatness, interpret every note as evidence of skill? Or did she hear what others heard and simply dismiss it, choosing instead to believe in the truth she had already chosen? The answer lies hidden within the smile in the mirror, serene, certain, untroubled by doubt. Her confidence extended beyond music into every part of her life. She dressed extravagantly, spoke with assurance, carried herself as though admired wherever she went. In restaurants, in shops, in theaters, she was unmistakable, a figure larger than life, wrapped in furs and jewels, moving through the city with the air of one who belongs to history. People stared, whispered, laughed. But Florence saw only admiration. The mirror she carried within her reflected the world always as she wished it to be. And yet, beneath this serenity, one cannot help but sense a shadow. For no illusion is entirely complete, no shield entirely impenetrable. Did Florence never, in quiet moments, feel the pang of doubt, the suspicion that others laughed at her? Did she never hear, however faintly, the cracks in her own voice? Perhaps she did, and perhaps she chose not to acknowledge it, burying the knowledge beneath layers of confidence and devotion. Or perhaps she truly never heard it at all, living in a world where her voice was flawless, her genius unquestioned, her destiny assured. The ambiguity lingers, deepening the tragedy of her story. What is certain is that her serene self-image allowed her to continue, to press ever forward toward larger audiences, greater stages, more ambitious performances. It gave her the courage to face the world's laughter without flinching, to turn mockery into applause simply by refusing to acknowledge the difference. It carried her from salons into theaters, from private recitals into public fame, from whispered amusement into notorious legend. Without her smile in the mirror, she might have retreated. With it, she became immortal. The image lingers. Florence before her mirror, dressed as an angel, her wings brushing against the edges of her reflection, her smile serene, her eyes shining with conviction. Behind her lies the city, restless, laughing, mocking. But before her lies only triumph, only glory, only applause. She bows to her reflection, hears the imagined ovation, and rises ready for her next stage. The smile fades softly into the glass, but from its surface emerges the creak of velvet curtains, waiting to rise upon the greatest test of her illusion. The moment when her serene self-image would face the vast audience of Carnegie Hall. The creak of velvet curtains waiting to rise is a sound that belongs to every theater, yet in the autumn of 1944 it seemed heavier, more portentous, as though the fabric itself sensed the strangeness of what it was about to reveal. For Florence Foster Jenkins, this was to be no ordinary evening, no drawing room recital nor rented hall filled with loyal admirers. This was Carnegie Hall, the most revered stage in New York, perhaps in the world, and she had chosen it as the crown of her life's journey, the final proof of her greatness. Tickets had sold out within hours, demand so fierce that scalpers were said to have stood on sidewalks offering them at inflated prices. More than 3,000 people would gather, their eyes fixed upon the stage, their ears ready to receive her voice. The decision to perform at Carnegie was hers, though Bayfield had reservations. He knew the safety of her salons, the controlled devotion of her circle, the indulgent laughter that remained discreet. He feared the vastness of a public audience, the cruelty of strangers, the sharpness of critics who would not soften their words. But Florence, serene in her reflection, saw only destiny. To her, Carnegie Hall was not a risk, but a confirmation. The final ascent to the heights she had always believed awaited her. She prepared for it with the same conviction that had carried her through decades of ridicule and applause, convinced that history would mark her as one of its great sopranos. Preparations consumed her. Programs were designed, gowns selected, costumes prepared. She planned her entrance, her gestures, her bows, rehearsing each before the mirror until they gleamed with practiced confidence. Invitations spread through the city, reaching not only her loyal admirers but strangers drawn by curiosity. Musicians eager to witness the spectacle, critics sharpening their pens, soldiers and civilians seeking amusement in the midst of war's darkness. The name Florence Foster Jenkins rang across New York like a riddle. Was she a genius or a joke, a diva or a fraud? The only way to answer was to see her at Carnegie. The night itself was electric. Outside, the city was weary from years of war, yet the theater district pulsed with life, with music, with lights that glowed defiantly against the gloom. Carriages and motor cars brought the crowd to the hall, their steps echoing on marble floors, their laughter mingling with anticipation. Within the vast auditorium, the chandeliers blazed, velvet seats filled, programs rustled in eager hands. The air was thick with perfume, with tobacco, with curiosity. Some came ready to laugh, others ready to applaud, but all came certain they would witness something unforgettable. Backstage, Florence prepared with serene calm. She donned her costume, a gown adorned with sequins, crowned with a wreath of laurel, as though claiming victory before a note was sung. Bayfield hovered near, offering encouragement, arranging details, concealing his anxiety. To him, this was a dangerous gamble, yet to her it was the inevitable culmination of her journey. She smiled at her reflection one last time, hearing the imagined ovation, and stepped toward the curtain. When it rose, the hall erupted in applause, loud, thunderous, a mixture of admiration, amusement, and anticipation. Florence bowed deeply, her arms sweeping wide, her face radiant. She believed the applause sincere, believed the audience gathered in reverence. And perhaps in that moment it was sincere, for even those who laughed could not help but admire her courage. To stand upon that stage, to face such a crowd, required a fearlessness rare in any artist. Then came the first notes. They soared into the air, sharp and wavering, filling the vast hall with the unmistakable sound of Florence Foster Jenkins. Gasps escaped. Laughter rippled discreetly, heads shook in disbelief. Yet she pressed on, undisturbed, her voice rising in arias by Mozart and Verdi, songs that demanded precision, but received only passion. She gestured grandly, raised her arms as though conducting invisible orchestras, moved with the grace of a woman utterly convinced of her genius. The audience, caught between ridicule and awe, responded with applause, sometimes sincere, sometimes ironic, always loud. The night unfolded as a spectacle unlike any other. She changed costumes between numbers, reappearing as angel, as Valkyrie, as diva, her sequins glittering under chandeliers, her wings brushing against curtains. Each entrance brought fresh applause, each aria fresh laughter hidden beneath it. The hall trembled not with harmony but with contradiction, a mingling of admiration and mockery, devotion and disbelief. Yet Florence remained untouched, her serene self-image intact, her smile unwavering. To her, every clap confirmed her greatness, every cheer validated her destiny. What did she feel? Standing on that stage, hearing the vast roar of applause, unaware or unwilling to know that much of it was laughter. Did she sense the difference? Did she glimpse the irony? Or did her vision shield her entirely? The truth is unknowable. Perhaps she lived the evening in pure triumph, believing at last she had conquered the pinnacle of artistry. Perhaps beneath her smile, she sensed the cracks, the cruel laughter concealed in thunderous ovation. The ambiguity lingers, deepening the tragedy of her story. For those in attendance, the concert became legend. Critics wrote of it with astonishment, some cruelly mocking her voice, others marveling at her courage. Audiences remembered it for years, recalling the strangeness, the hilarity, the unforgettable spectacle of a woman who dared to sing without talent, but with unshakable conviction. Carnegie Hall itself, accustomed to the greatest performers, had witnessed something altogether different that night. Not greatness in sound, but greatness in audacity, in self-belief, in the strange alchemy of tragedy and comedy. The creak of velvet curtains closed upon the evening, yet its echo lingered in New York and beyond. Florence left the stage radiant, convinced of triumph, her heart full of joy. Bayfield, anxious and weary, guided her away, uncertain how long the illusion could endure. Outside, the city buzzed with laughter, with gossip, with stories retold over dinners and drinks. Inside, Florence smiled serenely, certain she had achieved her destiny. The curtains tremble still in memory, and from their shadow emerges the sound of a single high note, trembling, breaking, lingering, unresolved in the air. A note that leads us into the aftermath, where applause fades into the sharper voices of critics. And Florence, for the first time, cannot entirely escape the ridicule she had long been shielded from. A single high note, trembling, then breaking, floated through the golden space of Carnegie Hall and seemed to fracture the silence into uneasy laughter and applause. It was as if the note itself, fragile and wavering, revealed in one instant the entire paradox of Florence Foster Jenkins, a woman whose confidence soared higher than her voice could ever follow, who offered her heart with absolute conviction, even as her body betrayed her with sound unfit for the music she attempted. That moment became the soul of the concert, repeated again and again with each aria she sang, a pattern of bold entrances, radiant gestures, uncertain notes, and thunderous responses from an audience caught between ridicule and fascination. The vast hall, accustomed to brilliance, trembled with contradiction. The chandeliers glowed steadily, indifferent to the strange drama unfolding beneath them, while the seats filled with 3,000 souls shifted restlessly, their reactions a mixture of amusement, bewilderment, and awe. Soldiers on leave from the war chuckled into their sleeves, young couples squeezed one another's hands in disbelief, society figures whispered behind their programs, and musicians sat with furrowed brows, half in horror, half in admiration of her fearlessness. Yet all of them applauded, for in that atmosphere of spectacle, applause was irresistible. Florence herself seemed radiant, untouched by any hint of disapproval. She raised her arms with grandeur, gestured as though summoning celestial choirs, and bowed deeply after each number. Between songs, she disappeared into the wings, emerging each time in a new costume more elaborate than the last. An angel with wings that brushed the stage curtains, a Valkyrie adorned with crown and breastplate, a queen robed in flowing silks. Each transformation brought gasps from the audience, not for the voice that followed, but for the vision itself, the audacity of a woman who claimed with her attire what her music could not. The accompanist at the piano played with steady professionalism, guiding her through the storm of notes, sometimes leaning into the keys more forcefully, as if to drown out her faltering pitch, sometimes softening to allow her voice its full, fragile exposure. He did not flinch, did not betray discomfort, but in his steadfastness one might sense the quiet heroism of a man determined to support her no matter what emerged from her throat. For her accompanists, like Bayfield and her circle, knew that to betray her confidence would be to wound her beyond repair. The audience shifted continually between laughter and applause. Some tried to suppress their mirth, covering smiles with handkerchiefs, stifling giggles behind gloved hands. Others surrendered to it openly, laughing aloud, their voices echoing through the hall. Yet the applause always followed, loud, thunderous, as though laughter itself demanded to be cloaked in ovation. It became impossible to separate sincerity from irony, devotion from ridicule. Florence heard only the applause, saw only the faces cheering, and believed herself triumphant. What strange energy filled the hall that night, neither wholly cruel nor wholly kind, but something in between. The energy of an audience united in the awareness that they were witnessing something unforgettable. For who could forget the sight of Florence Foster Jenkins standing before them, radiant in feathers and sequins, singing with all the conviction of a prima donna, though her voice faltered at every phrase. She had turned failure into spectacle, discord into legend, ridicule into applause. It was a performance unlike any other, one that defied the usual categories of success and failure, and yet beneath the laughter lay a vein of tenderness, even admiration. For the audience, though amused, could not deny her courage. To stand upon that stage, to face such a crowd, to sing so boldly in the face of mockery, this required a fearlessness that few possessed. Many left the hall laughing, but many also left reflecting on her audacity, her refusal to be silenced by doubt. She had given them not beauty, but something else, something stranger and perhaps more profound, a glimpse of what it means to believe utterly in oneself, to live so completely in one's dream that the judgment of others becomes irrelevant. Still, the critics did not share such tenderness. Their words, sharpened with irony, would cut deeply in the days that followed. But in the moment itself, Florence was radiant. She bowed repeatedly, basked in applause, and smiled serenely at her audience. To her, the night was a triumph, the culmination of her life's journey, the proof that she belonged among the greats. If laughter filled the hall, she did not hear it. If ridicule hid behind the applause, she did not see it. She heard only ovation, saw only admiration, felt only joy. The concert ended with the same grandeur with which it had begun. Florence, dressed in her final costume, bowed deeply before the vast audience, her smile serene, her arms open wide as though embracing them all. The applause roared, echoing through the hall, louder than any she had ever heard. She left the stage radiant, certain she had achieved her destiny, certain she had conquered Carnegie Hall. For those who were there, the memory lingered long after the chandeliers dimmed and the seats emptied. They told the story for years, recalling the strangeness, the hilarity, the unforgettable spectacle of Florence Foster Jenkins at Carnegie Hall. The single high note, trembling, then breaking, became a symbol of the night, a note that contained within it all the comedy, all the tragedy, all the irony of her life. The sound of that note lingers still, unresolved, echoing in memory. It fades slowly, giving way to the rustle of newspaper pages in the days that followed, when the voices of critics would rise sharper than applause, and Florence, for the first time, could not remain entirely untouched by the ridicule she had long ignored. Newspaper pages rustling in a quiet room carried a different sound than applause, a sound that was sharp, brittle, and merciless. In the days following Florence Foster Jenkins's appearance at Carnegie Hall, the press poured forth with reviews that did not soften their words behind indulgence or polite laughter. Critics who had long ignored her could not resist the spectacle of her triumph. They filled their columns with wit sharpened into cruelty, describing her voice as shrieks, her notes as accidents, her performance as a comedy dressed in grandeur. Where her admirers had always provided shelter, the newspapers tore away the curtain, exposing her to a wider ridicule than she had ever faced. The reviews spread quickly, read in cafes, in parlors, in barber shops, and offices. Strangers laughed at the descriptions, repeating them to friends, marveling at the absurdity of a woman who dared to sing at Carnegie Hall without the gift of music. For New York, weary of war and longing for amusement, the story became a delight, a shared joke that lifted the gloom of the times. But for Florence, whose serene reflection had never faltered, the laughter now pressed too loudly against her closed doors, seeping into her sanctuary. Bayfield tried, as always, to shield her. He dismissed the critics, told her they were jealous, told her the applause of 3,000 mattered more than the words of a handful of writers. Her loyal circle continued to praise her, insisting that her performance had been magnificent. Yet something had shifted. The scale of Carnegie Hall, the reach of the newspapers had made the laughter unavoidable. Florence could no longer escape it entirely. She may have smiled, she may have dismissed the words as envy, but the sting could not be wholly ignored. There are accounts that she did at last feel the wound. Friends recalled her quietness in those days, her weariness, her uncharacteristic hesitation. The serenity of the mirror may have wavered, if only slightly, as though a crack had appeared in the glass. For all her confidence, she was still human, still vulnerable to cruelty. To be mocked in whispers was one thing. To be mocked in headlines was another. She had long lived in the glow of her own belief, but now the shadow of ridicule fell directly upon her, and its weight was heavy. The tragedy of this moment lies not in the laughter itself, but in the timing. For Carnegie Hall had been her triumph, her dream fulfilled, her final ascent. She left the stage radiant, certain of glory, only to find that the world had crowned her not with laurels but with mockery. The irony was cruel. The very performance she believed immortalized her as a great diva, instead immortalized her as a figure of ridicule. History recorded her not as she imagined, but as she was perceived, not as a soprano, but as a spectacle. And yet, even here, there is ambiguity. Did Florence truly understand the extent of the ridicule? Did she believe the critics, or did she remain within her illusion, dismissing their words as noise beneath the music of her destiny? The accounts conflict. Some insist she never doubted, never faltered, never acknowledged the laughter. Others whisper that she was shaken, that she wept, that the cruel words pierced her heart. The truth lies hidden, as so much of her inner life does, behind the serene smile she carried to the end. Bayfield, faithful as ever, stood by her. He reassured her, reminded her of the applause, insisted that the critics did not matter. He may have believed it himself, or he may have simply wished to protect her from the truth. Her circle, too, closed ranks around her, offering flowers, gifts, words of praise. Yet they could not silence the city, nor the echo of printed words that spread beyond New York into other places, other ears, other hands stained with ink. The rustle of newspapers in quiet rooms became the sound of her decline, for in the weeks that followed, Florence's health began to fail. The strain of Carnegie, the exhaustion of performance, the sting of ridicule, all pressed upon a body already weakened by years of illness. She grew frailer, her energy diminished, her spirit clouded. The performance that was meant to crown her life instead hastened its end, as though fate, having played its cruel jest, was ready to close the curtain. There is poignancy in imagining her in those days, seated by a window in her apartment, the city bustling below, newspapers spread upon the table, her hands resting quietly upon her lap. Did she look out at the traffic, the lights, the restless movement of New York, and feel herself part of it still, or set apart, mocked, misunderstood? Did she replay the night of Carnegie in her mind, hearing only the applause, forgetting the laughter, preserving the memory as she wished it to be? Perhaps her mind, mercifully, chose the kinder version, the one where she was triumphant, adored, immortal. The rustling of papers fades into silence, but the wound remains, carried not only in her heart but in her body. Her health, already fragile, began to falter more swiftly. Her steps slowed, her strength waned. Those who loved her grew concerned, surrounding her with care, yet unable to restore what had been lost. The laughter of the world had left its mark, invisible but deep, and so the newspapers, once merely curious reports, became the final chorus of her life. They preserved her forever, but not as she imagined. They fixed her in history as the diva who could not sing, the singer whose fame was built on failure, the the woman whose greatest triumph was also her greatest tragedy. It is a cruel legacy, yet it is also unforgettable, and perhaps, in some strange way, it was what she sought all along: to be remembered, to be immortal, to live beyond herself in story and sound. The image lingers. Florence seated in her room, the papers spread before her, the sound of their rustling mingling with the fading applause still echoing in her memory. Her hands tremble, her breath grows heavier, and from the silence of those pages emerges the sound of labored breathing in a chamber dimmed with fading light. The body unraveling as the spirit, still radiant, begins its final descent. Labored breath in a chamber of fading light marked the weeks that followed her fateful night at Carnegie Hall. The applause still echoed in her mind, but her body could no longer bear the weight of her dream. Florence Foster Jenkins, who had lived for so many years in radiant defiance of illness and ridicule, began to weaken, her strength unraveling like a silken thread pulled too tightly. She had spent her life weaving the fabric of her own legend, yet the fabric now grew thin, fraying at the edges, as though the strain of that great performance had consumed what little remained of her vitality. The apartment she shared with Byfield became a place of stillness, its rooms darkened, its curtains drawn against the bright noise of New York. Outside, the city roared with victory parades and news of a world war drawing toward its close. But inside, Florence lay in quiet decline, her body already burdened by the long shadow of syphilis, struggled against exhaustion. The strain of Carnegie had been more than mere performance. It had been an act of will so consuming that afterward there was little left. The laughter of critics had struck a wound not only in her pride, but in her fragile health, and from that wound she did not recover. Bayfield remained by her side, his devotion steady even as her energy waned. He read to her, arranged flowers at her bedside, soothed her when weakness overwhelmed her. Friends from her circle visited, offering praise and affection, bringing gifts, speaking of her triumph as though to preserve the illusion one last time. They told her she had conquered Carnegie, that she was adored, that the world remembered her not with mockery, but with reverence. Whether she believed them or whether she clung to the echo of applause in her own memory, none could say. But in her eyes there was still a trace of that serene reflection, the belief that she had fulfilled her destiny. The chamber grew heavy with silence, broken only by her labored breathing, by the ticking of clocks, by the muffled sounds of the city drifting in through half-open windows. Sometimes she would hum faintly, a fragment of an aria, her voice thin and wavering, yet still filled with conviction. Even in decline, she seemed to sing, as though music was the last thread binding her to life. Her voice had never been beautiful, yet it had always been hers, and she clung to it until the end. There is a quiet tragedy in those final weeks. The woman who had filled halls with laughter and applause now confined to her bed, her wings folded, her sequins unworn, her mirror darkened. Yet there is also dignity, for she never surrendered her belief. She did not renounce her dream, did not apologize for her voice, did not acknowledge defeat. To the very end she remained Florence Foster Jenkins, diva, adored and immortal in her own mind. Her health declined swiftly. Some said it was a broken heart, others that her body had simply reached its limit after years of struggle. Whatever the cause, it was clear that the night of Carnegie had been both her triumph and her undoing, the peak and the precipice of her life. To stand upon that stage had been her greatest desire, and having achieved it, perhaps there was nothing more to sustain her. The body, deprived of purpose, surrendered. Bayfield, devastated yet loyal, watched her fade. He must have known that the world outside remembered her with laughter, yet within those rooms he maintained the illusion, speaking to her of admiration, of triumph, of the immortality she had sought. He held her hand, reminded her of the applause, and in his presence she remained the diva she believed herself to be. In this, his loyalty was complete. He preserved her dream until the very end, refusing to let the cruelty of the world intrude upon her final days. And so Florence drifted slowly toward death, her breath shallow, her body frail, her spirit still luminous. She died in 1944, only weeks after her Carnegie performance, her life cut short not by the ridicule of others, but by the weight of her own destiny. The hall that had echoed with laughter and applause became her final stage, and the decline that followed was the last act of her strange and tragic play. What remains most haunting is the ambiguity of her awareness. Did she die convinced of her triumph, secure in the applause that still echoed in her mind? Or did she, in her final moments, sense the laughter, feel the cruelty, and know herself betrayed? The truth is lost, carried away with her last breath, leaving only the legend of a woman who sang without talent, yet with unshakable conviction. The image lingers, a darkened chamber, curtains drawn, flowers fading in their vases, Bayfield seated quietly by her side, her breath slowing, her hands still adorned with rings, her spirit still radiant in its strange certainty. Outside, the city celebrates the nearing end of war, parades filling the streets, music and laughter rising into the night. Inside, one woman slips silently from the world, leaving behind not silence, but a legend that will outlast her. The chamber grows still, her breath ceases, and in the hush that follows there is only the memory of her voice, echoing faintly, cracked and wavering, but undiminished in conviction. That faint echo leads us into the next silence, the curtains drawn, the city outside unaware that within those rooms the dream of Florence Foster Jenkins has come to its end. Curtains drawn, a city outside unaware, created a strange dissonance in those last days of Florence Foster Jenkins. Beyond her apartment, New York pulsed with restless vitality, its streets alive with newsboys shouting of victories abroad, with parades swelling to celebrate the nearing end of war, with music pouring from radios into crowded apartments and cafes. Life surged forward with unrelenting force, yet within her quiet rooms time seemed to slow, thickened by silence, punctuated only by the labored rhythm of her fading breath. The city that had laughed at her, applauded her, whispered about her, carried on unknowing, while she withdrew into the stillness of her final days. The curtains remained closed most hours, shutting out the glare of autumn sunlight, turning her apartment into a chamber of half-light where shadows lingered across the furniture, where flowers slowly wilted in their vases, their perfumes mingling faintly with the scent of medicines and fading life. Bayfield moved softly through these rooms, his devotion unbroken. He arranged her pillows, read aloud to her from favorite volumes, adjusted the curtains when she wished to see only a sliver of the outside world. His presence was constant, a quiet sentinel beside her decline, his voice low, his touch gentle, as though the very air needed to be softened around her. Friends from her loyal circle visited, bringing gifts, speaking softly, their words careful, always filled with praise. They did not mention the newspapers, the cruel laughter that had followed Carnegie. They spoke instead of triumph, of admiration, of the glory she had achieved. They reminded her of the applause, of the flowers thrown at her feet, of the brilliance of her costumes glittering beneath chandeliers. In their voices she heard only affirmation, and whether she believed it or clung to it as comfort, it wrapped her final days in warmth. Florence herself remained serene, as if the illness consuming her body could not touch the radiance of her spirit. She spoke little, but when she did, her words often turned to music. She recalled her performances, described the feeling of stepping onto the stage, the applause rising like a tide, the light of chandeliers catching her sequins. She seemed to relive the moments she cherished most, preserving them in memory even as her body failed. At times, faintly, she would hum an aria, her voice thin and wavering, yet still filled with conviction. For her, singing was not something to be abandoned, it was the essence of her life, the thread that bound her to the world until the very end. The city outside celebrated, unaware that within this chamber, one of its strangest legends was fading. Victory parades marched through avenues, flags unfurled, trumpets blared. Yet here there was only quiet, the subdued rhythm of breath, the soft voice of Bayfield reading aloud, the occasional rustle of skirts as friends came and went. The world did not pause for her, nor did it mourn her yet. Her passing would be private, unnoticed by most, her legend only later recalled in laughter and story. And yet, in this stillness, there was dignity. Florence did not rage, did not despair. She remained as she had always been, serene, certain, radiant in her own belief. The serenity of her mirror, which had carried her through decades of ridicule, carried her now through death. Whether she knew the laughter or not, whether she sensed the irony of her legacy, she did not surrender her identity. She remained Florence Foster Jenkins, Diva, adored in her own reflection, certain of her greatness. Bayfield, watching her decline, must have felt the heavy weight of tragedy. For decades he had protected her, encouraged her, sustained her illusion. Now he faced the moment when even his devotion could not preserve her. He held her hand, reassured her, reminded her of her triumphs, spoke of her immortality. To him, her loss was not only the death of a companion, but the extinguishing of a strange, luminous flame that had lit his own life. He, too, would remember her, not for her failures, but for her courage, for the joy she found in her art, for the peculiar radiance that had filled their shared years. The days passed slowly, each one dimmer than the last, until at last Florence slipped into silence. She died quietly in 1944, only weeks after Carnegie Hall, her body finally succumbing to illness, her spirit departing as gently as her voice had lingered in life, wavering, fragile, but unmistakable. The curtains remained drawn, the city outside continued in its noise and triumph, unaware that within those walls a chapter had closed, a life had ended, a legend had been sealed. Her death did not bring great mourning, nor headlines of sorrow. The newspapers noted it, but without the fanfare that had greeted her performances. To most, she was a curiosity, a memory of laughter in a dark time, a spectacle once witnessed, now gone. Yet for those who knew her, for Bayfield and her circle, her passing carried weight. They had loved her, in their way, loved her eccentricity, her courage, her defiance of ridicule. They mourned her not as a joke, but as a woman who had lived according to her own dream, unshaken by the laughter of others. The image lingers, curtains drawn, flowers wilting, Bayfield seated beside her bed, her hand resting in his, her face serene in death as it had been in life. Outside, the city roars with parades, with victory, with laughter, but inside there is only stillness, the quiet echo of a life both tragic and triumphant. The silence deepens. The curtains remain closed, and from that stillness rises the next chapter. The legacy she left behind, the paradox of failure transformed into immortality, the legend of a woman who became unforgettable, not through genius, but through the strange alchemy of delusion and courage. A record spinning endlessly, crackling into night, became the truest emblem of Florence Foster Jenkins's legacy. For while her body had slipped quietly from the world, her voice remained captured in the grooves of shellac discs, repeating endlessly her strange mixture of audacity and frailty. Each spin of the needle brought her back, not as she imagined herself, a soprano of brilliance and purity, but as history had fixed her, a diva who could not sing, yet who sang nonetheless with conviction unbroken. These recordings, meant to preserve her triumph, preserved instead her paradox, ensuring that she would never be forgotten. In the months after her death, the world moved on swiftly. The war ended, soldiers returned home, cities erupted with joy, and Florence became a memory, whispered about at dinner tables, recalled with laughter by those who had attended her recitals. Yet the records endured, waiting patiently to be discovered by later generations. When played, they astonished listeners anew. The voice that wavered and cracked, the notes that slipped away from harmony, the fearless conviction in every phrase, all emerged again, fresh and immediate, as though Florence herself stood once more before the mirror, smiling serenely at her imagined triumph. What is it that compels us to return to those recordings, to listen not once, but again and again? Perhaps it is the comedy, the sheer absurdity of a singer so determined yet so incapable. Perhaps it is curiosity, the fascination with one who defied all expectation and still filled halls with eager audiences. Or perhaps it is something more tender, the recognition of courage, the strange admiration we feel for one who dared to stand before the world without fear, who transformed failure into legend by refusing to acknowledge it as failure at all. Her legacy grew in whispers, then in laughter, then in fascination. Musicians passed around her records as curiosities, marveling at the audacity of her attempts. Writers recalled her in essays and anecdotes, describing the unforgettable spectacle of her performances. Audiences who had once laughed discreetly now told the stories openly, embellishing details, preserving her in memory as a figure of both ridicule and affection. In time, she became a symbol not merely of poor singing, but of something larger, the human ability to believe in oneself against all odds, the strange dignity of delusion, the tragic comedy of a dream pursued without restraint. It is easy to mock her, yet more difficult to dismiss her entirely. For while her voice lacked beauty, her presence possessed a rare power. She demanded attention, demanded to be remembered, demanded immortality. And in this she succeeded more fully than many who sang with technical perfection, but left no lasting trace. How many sopranos of her era are forgotten now, their recordings silent on shelves, their names erased from memory? Yet Florence endures, her name still spoken, her records still played, her legend still alive. Failure became her immortality. The paradox of her legacy is this: she is remembered not in spite of her lack of talent, but because of it. The very thing that doomed her as a musician secured her as a figure of history. Had she sung competently, she would have been one among many. By singing disastrously, she became singular, unforgettable, immortal. Her story reminds us that history does not always crown the skilled, but often the remarkable, and she was remarkable indeed. And yet, beneath the laughter, there lingers sorrow. For Florence did not seek comedy, she sought glory. She did not imagine herself a curiosity, but a diva. Her tragedy lies in the gap between her vision and her reality, between the applause she believed sincere and the laughter that often accompanied it. To remember her only as a joke is to overlook the pathos of her life, the illness that shaped her, the betrayal that scarred her, the courage that carried her. Her legacy is not laughter alone, but also the quiet ache of a woman who longed for beauty and believed she had found it. The records spin still, their crackle carrying her into new ears, new generations. Listeners laugh, but some also pause, unsettled by the conviction in her voice, by the certainty that rings through every note, however flawed. For it is impossible to listen to her without sensing the depth of her belief, the sincerity of her dream. In that sincerity lies her immortality, for sincerity, even when misguided, possesses a power that cannot be erased. Her name has become legend, invoked in conversations about art, about delusion, about courage. She has been portrayed on stage and screen, her story retold in plays and films, her figure reimagined in novels and essays. Each retelling preserves the paradox, the mixture of laughter and admiration, the strange fascination with a woman who lived entirely within her own reflection. Her image in angel wings, her voice straining through Mozart, her serene smile before the mirror, these remain etched in cultural memory. A record spins, crackles, falters, and continues. In its imperfect sound lies the essence of Florence Foster Jenkins, the refusal to stop, the insistence on singing, the courage to believe. Her legacy is not the beauty of her voice, but the persistence of her spirit, the reminder that greatness is not always found where we expect it. Sometimes it lies in failure transformed by conviction, in tragedy wrapped in laughter, in delusion that becomes, in its way, a kind of truth. The image lingers, a gramophone turning in a quiet room, the needle tracing grooves worn by time, her voice rising once more into the night. Outside, the city hums with life, unaware, but inside, the sound persists, strange, fragile, unforgettable. The record spins, the crackle deepens, and from that unresolved sound emerges the final note of her story, drifting into silence, inviting reflection on what her life truly meant. Delusion, courage, tragedy, comedy, or all of these entwined. A final unresolved note drifting into silence lingers as though suspended between laughter and sorrow, between ridicule and reverence. It is the sound that carries Florence Foster Jenkins into memory, the voice that could never quite reach its intended pitch, yet refused to surrender. Her story does not end with her last breath, nor with the spinning of her records, but with the questions she leaves behind. Questions that resist resolution, questions that echo like that trembling note, haunting and unfinished. Was she deluded, blind to the truth of her own voice? Or was she courageous, refusing to be silenced by limitations and ridicule? Did she know, deep within herself, that audiences laughed and choose to embrace the laughter as applause? Or did she live and die sincerely convinced of her genius, untouched by mockery? No answer is final, for each interpretation reveals as much about us as about her. To some, she is a comedy, to others a tragedy, and to many both at once. In reflecting upon her life, one cannot escape the irony that she achieved the immortality she craved, though not in the way she imagined. She longed to be remembered as a great artist, a soprano of divine gifts, a figure worthy of Carnegie Hall. Instead, she is remembered as the opposite, as a singer whose voice was profoundly flawed, whose fame was built on failure. Yet immortality she achieved nonetheless, and perhaps this is the greater triumph. For history remembers not always the skilled, but always the unforgettable, and Florence was unforgettable. Her story touches upon something universal, the tension between dream and reality, between how we see ourselves and how the world perceives us. Most of us live with compromises, with quiet awareness of our limits. Florence refused such compromises. She chose to believe only in her dream, to reject any truth that threatened it, to live wholly within her vision of herself. In that choice lies both her tragedy and her genius. She became not merely a poor singer, but a legend, a myth of modern times, a parable of human folly and courage entwined. One might say she represents the comedy of delusion, yet there is also grandeur in her refusal to yield. To step onto the stage of Carnegie Hall dressed in feathers and sequins, her voice untrained, her confidence unshaken, was an act of audacity that most of us could never attempt. We laugh at her, yet we also marvel at her fearlessness. She reminds us that to live boldly is sometimes to live absurdly, and that failure, when embraced with conviction, can carry a strange kind of victory. Her legacy endures in the contradictions it embodies. Musicians study her not for technique, but for the lesson she offers, that art is not only about perfection, but about passion, about daring, about the willingness to stand before the world and declare oneself. Audiences continue to listen to her recordings, to laugh, to shake their heads in disbelief, but also to feel a quiet admiration for her spirit. She's been portrayed in plays and films, reimagined in novels, discussed in essays. Her name persists, woven into culture as a symbol of eccentricity, of delusion, of courage. And so the unresolved note continues, asking us to reflect not only on Florence, but on ourselves. Do we not all carry dreams that outstrip our abilities? Do we not all imagine ourselves greater than we appear, singing in mirrors unseen by others, bowing before audiences that exist only in our minds? Florence simply lived her dream openly, unapologetically, without disguise. She turned private fantasy into public performance, and in doing so, she forced the world to witness the paradox of human aspiration, that we are at once capable of grandeur and folly, courage and blindness. Her story, when told in laughter alone, misses its depth. When told in tragedy alone, misses its humor. It must be told in both, for Florence herself was both. She was ridiculous and sublime, deluded and courageous, mocked and adored. She was in the end human, no less flawed than any of us, though far more fearless in the expression of her flaws. And that, perhaps, is why she endures, because she reveals to us the comedy and tragedy of our own dreams, the unresolved notes we each carry within us. The image lingers. Florence before the mirror, her wings brushing its edges, her smile serene, her eyes radiant. She hears applause only she can hear, sees adoration only she can see, believes in greatness only she can feel. Behind her lies a city laughing, before her lies eternity listening, and between the two she stands, singing her final note, unresolved yet unforgettable. The note drifts into silence, yet silence does not erase it. It remains in memory, in story, in laughter, in admiration, in the records that still spin and crackle, carrying her voice into nights long after her death. Florence Foster Jenkins, the diva who could not sing, yet who sang with unshakable conviction, remains with us, her life a parable of courage and delusion, her legend eternal.